Hi, I'm Steve Hendrick.
And I'm Tina Burbine.
Welcome back to our Let's Talk Data series. In our last episode, we talked about the importance of having a defined approach for your MPI or EMPI because of the impact on all of your organization's patient data. Today, we're going to talk about data migration and archiving. This is a hot topic as health systems look to consolidate EHRs, modernize existing applications, and merge with or acquire other health systems. Before we jump into this, let's summarize what we've learned in our past episodes in preparation for today's discussion. The EMPI has a direct impact on an organization's patient data experience. As your team's MPI or EMPI processes mature, so do your analytics and data capabilities. Leverage your action-oriented data committee for collaborative data decisions. And don't forget that data is a team sport. Tina, how about you kick us off with starting with why a mature MPI or EMPI is so important for successful data migration and archival?
Sure. Patient demographic data is always the first data set that we begin with and provides the foundational information in a record to then attach provider, clinical, and financial data to. The demographic data is not clean. There's severe consequences such as lost historical data, which can be a patient safety and, of course, a cost concern. So your MPI or EMPI duplicate rate is recommended to fall within the industry best practices of 3% or lower before tackling any data migration or archive project work. Please check out our last video about an EMPI cleanup if more information about that topic would be helpful for your team. So once your patient demographic data is clean and a low duplicate rate's achieved, it's critical to thoroughly understand the other data domains that are going to be migrated. So begin with the data domain types and structures of the legacy source systems. Oftentimes, teams turn to their legacy source system vendors to obtain that documentation if it doesn't already exist internally. And that information is necessary to support the initiation and planning phase of any data migration project that outlines the structure, the type, the size, and the data ownership. Engage your action-oriented data committee to support the data ownership accountability piece. This proactive planning work will prevent a lot of manual bad data remediation after the data migration is started. Remember that the remediation work to correct bad data is always manual, meaning it's time-consuming and it's going to require a lot of your team's effort, which extends the timeline of any data migration project. So avoid that pitfall and do your research and due diligence to bring together the data domain, source system structure documentation, and involvement of the action-oriented data committee. Steve, what are some other things that need to be completed in the planning initiation phase?
Oftentimes, organizations struggle internally to agree on the meaning of the legal medical record, which makes it absolutely impossible to explain it to third-party vendors assisting with the data migration and archival work. If the organization is migrating data into an archival system to enable the complete decommissioning of the legacy source system, the Action-Oriented Data Committee and the Revenue Cycle HIM Governance Committee need to join forces to review the current definition of the legal medical record and identify any updates that may need to be made to accommodate future state. This must be agreed upon and documented as it directly impacts decisions about the span of the historical data that will be migrated and retained.
That's right, Steve. In today's market, we now have access to functionality like digital data shredding that could not be done years ago. So this means that teams are revisiting retention policies at the same time they're discussing the legal medical record definition. At a minimum, the data being migrated into the archival system must meet the legal medical record and data retention requirements. And this is a great example of why we view data being a team sport. It takes the village. As the Action-Oriented Data Committee and Rev Cycle HIM governance committees join forces, they're going to tackle together how much data is going to be migrated and how that's going to be accomplished, which requires the input of business, clinical, and technical talent from across the organization. So Steve, can you talk about the importance of addressing the data validation strategy during the planning phase?
Sure, Tina. The data validation strategy has a direct impact on how many and the types of resources that will be needed throughout the project. Archive solution vendors will provide recommendations, but organizations must align those recommendations with industry data migration best practices and their own resource requirements to support the validation work. Your archive or legacy system vendors can be leveraged to manage the extraction and the load. They will also do an initial validation, but no vendor will deliver all of the data validation necessary throughout the project. And keep in mind, data validation work is one of the most resource-intensive activities in the project timeline. There are 4 key components to address in data validation strategy, including the identification of resources who will be tapped to do the business, clinical, and financial data validation. This is separate from the technical validation, but must be done in parallel. Remember, the technical validation is focused on the format of the data element, while the business validation is focused on ensuring it makes sense for practical use after it's migrated. Second is the amount of data that must be validated and how it happens. There must be a statistically valid sample size for each data type being migrated. The margin of error and confidence interval can be adjusted to meet the risk level of the specific data type. This will define the volume of manual data validation required. For the technical validation work, depending on the archive vendor and the legacy source system vendors you may be working with, reports should be available, but if they aren't, they will need to be created. Third, determine how random sampling will be performed. Start with outlining a wide range of scenarios for the data being migrated. Workflows and data schema tend to change throughout the years, so it's important to validate examples before and after the changes have been made. For example, imagine imaging data was previously stored as a text note and then was transitioned into an interfaced PDF document from a third party. Both of these scenarios must be reviewed and validated to ensure they are migrated appropriately. Finally, the validation strategy must include a process for sign-off and how issues are handled. For example, defining a threshold for complete revalidation based off of the size of the issues occurred, and outlining the sign-off requirements. Everything I've just covered directly impacts the resource planning and the types of skill sets that are needed for the project. The planning work will also assist in defining the amount of historical data that can be migrated if you have any budget limitations. Tina, after the data migration strategy has been developed and the plan's been created, what are some helpful tips in delivering on a migration and archive project to assure it stays on time and on budget?
As you look to start executing, create a dashboard that highlights the data migration progress by data type. Utilizing a status dashboard throughout the project will assist in ensuring the project stays on track and enables a quick escalation path to the right stakeholders as needed. If we look to the visual provided, there are some sample indicators that we feel are important to include. First, the migration strategy. This tracks when the data is moving through the process. The migration scope. It tracks the status of determining the duration of time for the historical data, the specific fields and data types that are going to migrate. The mapping translation, it tracks the mapping progress of the tables being built, validated, and signed off. Validation tracks all of the non-production validation completeness. And audit documentation tracks the details of outlining all of the mapping that's been completed, the scope of the data being migrated, and the validation results as they happen. This documentation workbook is a really critical component that captures all of the data mapping tables, how the data has been extracted, what the extraction criteria was, and what the validation workflow steps were. And this is recommended in case it's needed in the future after production go live occurs as any kind of look back documentation that might be needed by the team. Finally, production migration. This tracks much of the defined migration scope that's been moved into the target system production environment, followed overall by the status, which tracks the high or critical risks and issues that are impacting a specific data type or multiple types and its progress. And who doesn't love a good dashboard? So utilizing something like this is a great tool that supports the communication plan and the transparency of the project progress overall. We've covered so much today in a quick amount of time. So Steve, please do a recap for us.
Sure, let me summarize real quick. The patients are a core building block for data migration and archive. Any issues migrating the patient demographic data will have a direct impact on the connecting data types. All the planning work we've highlighted will help ensure that you have a smooth project execution. Encourage your action-oriented data committees and the Revenue Cycle HIM Governance Committee to join forces to support defining the future state legal medical record and data retention requirements. A thorough validation strategy must be developed to ensure data integrity throughout the migration and archive process. Also, use a dashboard transparently to track data migration progress and communicate out to stakeholders.
Thanks, Steve. If you'd like to talk further with us about any of these concepts or processes, please don't hesitate to reach out. We're passionate about data, and we want your data migration and archive projects to be successful. Look for our next episode in our series, Let's Talk Data, where we'll talk about Agile Analytics. On behalf of Steve, myself, and the entire Health Link Advisors team, thank you for joining us.